Thank you, everyone. In terms of background, my background is statistics and machine learning, so don't blame me, but I actually did my PhD in computational biology and in a lab doing a lot of genetics and using quite a lot of genetic data, and I'm now working with genetic data, so quite familiar with all that. And I'm also saying that to say I'm not, I'm going to point at things, but I've probably done a lot worse in my time. So it's not to say we shouldn't do science anymore at all. I probably don't need to convince any of you here, really, that high-performance computing is great, has enabled amazing discoveries. I purposefully didn't pick only biology, but across all fields of science. Where it gets a little bit tricky is it also helped a lot with climate change. And there are lots of situations where we can improve our understanding of climate change, our understanding of weather forecasts, optimize energy grids, and so on. And that's obviously the kind of challenging relationship between high-performance computing and climate change. If you're interested in these applications, there's this report by the British Royal Society that is quite interesting. It lists a lot of good applications of technologies. But all that comes at a cost. And interestingly, there was not so long ago, EMBL released their environmental footprint report. And there are lots of, really interesting insights. A couple of numbers that I find striking. They found that it's around 65 tons of CO2 equivalent per publication. For context, the IPCC threshold is 2 tons per person and per year if we want to keep global warming under vague control. So that's quite a big number. And they found that it's around 29 tons per full-time equivalent staff in the institute. So again, not at all. I love EMBL, and EBI is just down the road from us here in Cambridge, and not at all blaming them for any of that. It's just pointing out the orders of magnitude that would translate very probably across all fields of biology and most fields of science as well. So if we look at data centers, obviously not all of that is data centers. So if we look at data centers, one of the numbers that goes around is around 100 megaton of CO2 equivalent, which is the global carbon footprint of data centers, and that's the same as the American commercial aviation. So quite a big number again. You could say not all data centers are doing scientific stuff, and you would be right. So if we zoom in on some particular analysis, for example, using genetic data. So if we focus on the genome-wide association study, and if we look at something like 1,000 traits in UK Biobank, using maybe not the latest software, that can be up to 17 tons of CO2 equivalent. Again, for that carbon footprint, so from London, I could fly to Paris every morning for breakfast and then fly back for the office. And I could do that every morning for 6 months for the same carbon footprint. It would be absolutely lovely, maybe not great for my waistline, but otherwise not great for the environment either. Now, it's not to say that all analysis have to have such a big footprint. And so, for example, if we look at metagenome assembly, it doesn't require that much computing resources, and we're talking 14 kilograms. So not negligible, but a lot smaller. Or we can look at RNA read alignment, again, even fewer resources, and we're talking 240 grams. And the idea of this slide is to show that not all computational pipelines have very large carbon footprints. The point is not to become completely paranoid and overthink every single keystroke, but the fact that some of these analyses have very significant impacts just points at the fact that we need to be a bit mindful overall. Now, it's not only biology. I picked biology because of the topic today, but AI obviously is a massive issue. There was this paper recently, well, not so recently, but really interesting. GPT-3, the first row here, that's the ancestor of ChatGPT. So that was before it became famous. 552 tons to train that model. And then that was GPT-3, and then they had 3.5 and then 4 and all the iterations in between. So not quite a one-off cost. Okay, so part of the problem with computing, maybe as opposed to wet lab research, is that computing is not free, but from a user point of view, it very much looks like it. And there are great differences between institutions, but let's say as a postdoc in a university, it is quite rare that the limiting factor is compute, that they say, we don't have the budget to do research. It usually gets absorbed in overall overhead costs and operational costs. And so it looks like computing is free. which is a problem because then it can be tempting to waste it. Now, for today, I'm not going to talk about emails or things like that. I'm very much going to focus on intense computations and you know, it either takes a long time to run or it requires a lot of resources to do so. And this slide was quite interesting. When I started working on that, which actually is just over 4 years ago now, this slide was very empty. There was like 2 papers from AI and that was about it. And it's been really good to see over the past 2-3 years, a really big interest from all aspects of science. And so, you know, things like neuroscience or, you know, some aspects of physics or astronomy. And so that's really interesting to see how different fields are picking it up and very encouraging as well. For what I'm going to talk about today, it doesn't really matter what you think about when you think about high performance computing. It can be, you know, running a gaming computer on the desktop, or it can be using an institutional data center or virtual machines or whatever. The same principles apply. And when we think about the environmental impact of computing, there are 3 main aspects. The first one is life cycle footprint of the hardware, and that's one that is generally underestimated. And it includes like extracting the raw material, manufacturing it, shipping it across the world, using it for its entire lifetime, and then disposing of it. And when we talk about consumer devices, that's your phone, your laptop, your tablet, 70 to 90% of this entire cradle to grave footprint is only from manufacturing. So that shows that for these, how you use them is kind of irrelevant. You know, the biggest difference we can do is to keep our devices for longer so another one doesn't get produced, basically. When we talk about data centers, this share can be reduced just because they get used so much more that the pie is a lot bigger, basically. So the manufacturing share reduces, but it's still quite a significant share. And if we go at the other end of the spectrum, so disposing of waste, that's the depressing slide of the day. There's this report by the World Health Organization into children and electronic waste, or e-waste, and they find that 80% of the 50 million tons of e-waste are handled by up to 50 million, what they call nicely, informal waste workers, which means dump sites. And the waste processing industry involves almost 20 million children. Unsurprisingly, electronic waste are also predicted to rise quite sharply in the coming years. So that just shows that manufacturing and disposing of electronic waste is a massive issue, with all the health consequences you can imagine with, you know, processing batteries and heavy metals. And so that just highlights the importance of being mindful of what we do with the hardware we have. Now, the second aspect, which very relevant to what you were talking about today, is long-term data storage. And we are very much into the petabyte world now. And I mean, for individual projects, you know, the first picture of the black hole I had in the first slide is about 5 petabyte. UK Biobank was aiming for 15 petabyte by 2025, but I think they've passed that already. So, you know, we're talking about a large amount of data. And it takes electricity to store data. If we look at an average data center, about half of the power provided goes to the servers, but the rest is 40% overhead and 10% storage. And the overhead is mostly keeping everything nice and cool. And so 10% is not completely negligible. There are lots of numbers and it depends on the technology and so on. But in general, if you want to remember an order of magnitude, it's around 10 kilograms of CO2 equivalent to store 1 terabyte of data for a year. So that's kind of the order of magnitude, and that just shows the importance of, sure, we want to, you know, duplicate the data and we want to have enough backups and everything, and that's really important because usually it takes more carbon to rerun the experiment than it takes to save the data. But we don't want to like save too much data or save so much data that we don't even know where it is, and that's why it's quite important to include deleting data as part of proper data management plans, which is usually the steps that's kind of forgotten in the process. And that takes us to powering the computer, which is maybe what you were expecting from this. Now, understanding for an individual project, the impact of powering the computer is quite simple. We need to figure out how much energy we need, and that just depends on what we're doing. So what hardware we have and what software we're using. And then we need to figure out the carbon footprint of producing this electricity. And that mostly depends on where you are in the world, because most data centers are connected to the country's power grid. So that's the only equation today. I'm not going to go into too much details because of time, but roughly the energy we need, it depends on the running time. It depends on how much power. The main two components are processing cores, so CPU or GPU, and memory. And you know, if that doesn't really ring a bell, just ignore that. And then the efficiency of the data center. That's how much extra power is needed for overheads. And it tends to be quantified by this little metric, which is called PUE, for power usage effectiveness. It's a very simple metric. It's the ratio of the total power provided to the facility divided by the power actually used for IT equipment. So it has to be greater than 1. The closer to 1, the better. And for the average data center, we're around 1.6, but the best data centers in the world, the most efficient ones, are nearing 1.1 now. And so if you're interested about why these are included, we put everything in our paper. And that takes us to the second aspect, which is carbon intensity. And so that's the carbon footprint of producing electricity. Now, that varies greatly between countries, and that's probably the biggest factor variation. Taking 2 countries, let's say you relocate your compute from Norway to India, that multiplies, not India, Australia, try again. So from Norway to Australia, we multiply carbon footprint by 17. And that's just because Norway is using a lot of renewable energy, and Australia, despite being at the forefront of the consequences of climate change, decides that coal is the way to go. Don't ask me why. But and so that shows that exactly same hardware, exactly same software, relocated, massively different impact. And that's something that's tricky because we don't have a lot of leverage on that. That's like public policies and so on. But good to know. And if you're interested into more real-time data, this website called Electricity Map is really interesting, and it shows real-time data for lots of different places, and you can zoom in on a particular country. You can see where the energy is being imported from and the split, and that's really interesting. Okay, I always put this slide at this moment because I'm not saying we shouldn't do science anymore, just that there are some cases where actually better science also aligns with better, more sustainability. So it doesn't have to be a trade-off. And in line with that, after a couple of years working on this, we thought, okay, maybe we need something a little bit like the FAIR principles for open data, some kind of guiding principles for environmentally sustainable computational science moving forward. And so we decided to team up with different stakeholders to have a bit of an overview. So research institutes, things like Emboli BI or Health Data Research UK, but also funders, UKI, the Wellcome Trust, and us at Cambridge as a university. And we try to come up with greener principles because it's science. We need to come up with an acronym. That was almost the hardest part of the project. ChatGPT wasn't available then. It was too early. And so we came up, and I'm just going to run through them briefly for the rest of this talk. And that's just an idea to give, an overview of how we could kind of go in the right direction moving forward. So the first two are governance and responsibility. And in brief, it's, who can make a difference and who is in charge. And it's going to be a very boring answer, really, to say basically everyone. In sustainability, there's a lot of brilliant grassroots movements, things driven by PhD students or undergrads or lab technicians or postdocs. And that makes a real difference. And that's really what starts change. The problem, and we need those. The problem with grassroots movements is at some point we start hitting a ceiling and we can't make as much difference as we want to. And that's why we need some kind of top-down approaches involving head of institutions, PIs, but also funding bodies, governments, journals. And all that is all brilliant, but a lot of compute happens in industry. And so we need to include industry in all that as well. So basically, the good news with that is it doesn't really matter what your role is. If you want to get involved, there is probably a space for you to do so. So I wanted to just take an example of a research institute. And, by centralizing data, and I mean, we heard a lot about examples of that. And I'm sure we've got people probably from SIB here who can talk about that. I'm sorry, the example I had is from EBI because they're from down the road. But the exact same thing would apply to the data sources made available by SIB and other kind of international research institutes. But the fact that there are so many data, the example of the AlphaFold database, for example, that made all the structures available following the FAIR principles has a massive impact because it saves well, it's a good scientific practice, but it also saves a lot of people from retraining the model. And so that shows the kind of benefit for the environment that research institutions can have. Another thing is how can we work on certification? And that's something that people have been asking for. You may be aware of some of the wet lab certifications that exist, things like LEAF or MyGreenLab. And so people kept asking us, could you do the same thing for dry labs, for computational labs? And so we've been working on that for the past year. We did a pilot that concluded at the end of 2023. And so now we're trying to put it out. So that should get released in the next few months. We're hoping for kind of a wider release, some kind of, you can to help dry labs move towards more sustainability. Now, in practice, how do we want to estimate carbon footprints? And again, because of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But if you're interested, we put out this kind of very short article that summarizes the main tools, so that can be an easy read. But in summary, there are a lot of Python packages. Problem is they're all Python, and well, biologists love R among other things. But they all these tools were built by data scientists doing machine learning, and they're good when they work. They have some limitations, but they're kind of a tracker. You put it in your code, it tracks what your code's doing. They have pros and cons, but when they work, they can be really good. When we started working on that, we're like, well, we need something that any scientist can use across all fields of science, and they don't have to install anything. And so that's what motivated the first thing we did, which was this Green Algorithms online calculator, where you can just put in what kind of hardware you're using, what kind of resources, runtimes, and then it gives estimates of carbon footprint based on locations and so on. And that makes it really interesting because you can use it. I know it's being used a lot for training as part of lectures and courses, but also it can be used before a project starts to have an idea of what will be the environmental cost of a project. So it's all open source, all the data is accessible. Problem of an online calculator is it's quite painful if your job has 100 different parameters and so on. So with light of that, with all of that, it'd be brilliant if you could go on your data center and say, what is my carbon footprint, and put a start date, end date, and it gives you carbon footprint. And the data centers track most of what we do on them, because then they need to charge your PI for it. And so I really didn't want to have to write my PhD thesis, and so I started coding it. And it works with Slurm. It's not very sophisticated, but basically it pulls all the logs, it applies the same method, and it estimates carbon footprint. Giving a lot more accurate metrics, things like failed jobs, which is always a bit heartbreaking, or memory of a location and so on. It's again completely open source, and if you're interested in testing it, well, you can do it, or please do get in touch, especially if it works, or if it doesn't, actually, either way. The thing with that is like, okay, well, it's not quite as pretty, but it opens up a whole world of monitoring carbon footprint from individual level, but also all the way up to institutions. And so that's basically what we're working on now, to have institutional dashboards. So we got, again, pretty close to release now, doing some pilots, something that some institutions have already. So it's not completely new, but we're teaming up with people at Emboli BI who have put something together like that, to have open source, easy to deploy, and reliable dashboard. So again, if you're interested in these kind of things, please do get in touch. And something I heard you talk about Elixir and pipelines, and so another pipeline is Nextflow that some of you might be using. And actually, some people at Nextflow have basically implemented our calculator into Nextflow. So now by just adding a flag, you can track carbon footprint across an entire pipeline, which is incredibly exciting. I say beta, but I think the first version has actually just come out in the past couple of weeks. So it's just a simple plugin, and that's a very exciting development as well. And what do we do with this information? Well, one thing we can do is be transparent about it. So one of the things we started doing in our lab is include carbon footprint acknowledgements at the end of our publications, just recognize the contribution of our work. And more and more people are starting to do that just as a way to raise awareness. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And just to wrap up, actually, this paper is what started the whole project, because initially we were just thinking, what is the carbon footprint of what we're doing in the lab? And then we realized there was no tool, so we had to build a tool. And then all of a sudden, a 2-week project turned into 4 years. But initially, the idea was just to do that. And so finally, once we had built the tool, we could go back to it. And So if we zoom out on that, we can fit GWAS in the frame. But as you'll notice, a simple update of Bolt LMM can save you a lot of carbon. So I'm not going to get into details. If your reaction to that is, oh, but you didn't test my favorite tool, or you didn't test my field of expertise, I'm like, I'm very sorry, but you're actually the best person, the best place to do it. So please, just do it, just and let us know or not, or just put it online. It doesn't matter. Just as a way to raise awareness. It's very easy to do because if you have the data, if that's the kind of analysis you're familiar with. So the idea of that was just to give a quick overview, but I'm fully aware that there are a lot of blind spots in that. And so from measuring to reducing, so we put out these 10 simple rules that I talked about a lot of those already, so I'm not going to expand on that, but if you're interested, it's an easy read. I'm just going to pause on the trade-off idea, because we say, well, it's all about cost and benefit. How do we quantify them? And I like the way the Royal Society put it, which is to say, well, let's say for technology in pursuit of net zero, I would probably argue any kind of new technology must be energy proportionate, in the sense that there should be a reasonable expectation that the benefits, however we define that, can outweigh those environmental costs as well. And I think just by taking a minute to ask this question, we can actually make a big difference already. And it's actually really complicated, this idea of cost and benefit, because the population who will suffer the most from climate change are probably not the population who will benefit from the latest generation of Apple Siri or Amazon Alexa smart speaker. And so that makes the whole, again, I don't have a solution there. It just makes the whole cost benefit a lot more complicated. And that brings us to the end of the greener principle, education and research. Obviously, we need more training and we need research because we don't understand everything yet about computers, and there's a lot of ways we can improve all that. So why do we need that to lead to cultural change? Well, rebound effect is this nasty thing. You make a tool 10 times more efficient to reduce carbon electricity usage. As a result, everyone uses it 100 times more. That's brilliant for innovation, brilliant for research, slightly less so if your goal was consumption reduction in the first place. So we need to be mindful and change the way we think about computational science in general. And I'll just wrap up on that. A community we're trying to build. So we organized this workshop hybrid last year, and we're hoping it will become kind of an annual conference around environmentally sustainable science. And if you're interested in that, for now, it's just a Google form. If you scan this QR code, or I'll put the link in the chat just after that. But the idea is to build a community of practice. So I need to do it. I'll do it. For now, it's Google form asking your views about what format it should take. Everything I talked about, it's on our website. And I'll finish by thanking a million different people who've been involved with that throughout. And yeah, happy to take questions if there's time. Thanks.